creators were?
Siegel and Schuster.
Right. Who were Siegel and Schuster? Very good.
I think they lived in New York.
They didn't. You're from Brooklyn, and you think that everybody important lived in New York. That's a very good guess. And they lived actually in the middle of the country in the American heartland in Cleveland, Ohio. And they grew up in a part of Cleveland, Ohio called Glenville that was very poor and that in those days was 95% Jewish. And these were two kids who we knew a little bit about them, but when I was researching my book, one of the only good things that ever comes of a lawsuit is that it opens up troves of documents. And Siegel and Schuster's heirs are suing the biggest media company in the world, Time Warner, which owns Superman through DC Comics. And one of the things that I saw that had never been out there before was the memoir, a 150-page memoir that Jerry Siegel wrote, explaining why he wrote Superman. People over the years have come up with brilliant stories, some of which were true, and some of which were repeated often enough that we thought they were true. But what it turns out is, this guy, Jerry Siegel, was what we in today's terms would call bullied. He was a kid who would go on the playground, and he was a sort of schlubby-looking kid. He was a little too short, a little too round, wore glasses that were a lot too thick. And every day when he'd go out on the playground, kids would taunt him. Boys would come up to him and say, "Seagull, seagull, birds of an eagle." And I don't know what that meant, but it sure meant that it was very cutting to him. And he wished that the girls hadn't heard that. And he wished that he could fly away. And every night when Jerry Siegel would go to bed, he would bring a pad of paper with him and a pencil. And he would fly away in his dreams, in these stories that he was imagining. He would imagine that he had enormous strength and that he had the power to do everything, including flying. And the character that he came up with was not the Superman that we know. The first character he came up with was somebody called the Super-Man. And this was a bad guy. This was a guy who wanted to control the world, earn lots of money, and use his powers to basically get dominance. One day in Cleveland, something happened to Jerry that changed his notion of who his hero would be. And that something was his dad owned, people know what a haberdashery was, a used clothing store, in a bad part of Cleveland, a part that was a little bit dangerous. And one day, three guys walk into that store. One of them tries on a suit, and they walk out without paying. And Michael Siegel starts following them out of the store, and he has a massive heart attack. He dies and never makes it to the hospital even. So Jerry Siegel, the youngest of 6 kids of these Lithuanian Jewish immigrants, suddenly is bereft. He's lost his role model, he's lost his dad. A night not long after that, when he's going to bed with his pad and paper, the Superman that he envisions is not the Superman who was the bad guy. He's dropped he's dropped the hyphen, and he's dropped the bad guy act. And suddenly we have a hero. When Jerry woke up the next morning with his story and took it across the street to his buddy Joe Shuster's house to draw this hero, the hero that he drew was a hero that was coming in to rescue a man who was being robbed, who looked an awful lot like Michael Siegel. And this hero did what Jerry couldn't do. He saved his dad. So Superman, rather than being a story of somebody conceiving of what we needed as a hero, he was a little boy who was conceiving of what he needed as a hero to make it through to the next day. Now, he invented this hero at a moment in American history that any publisher, including mine, would dream about. It may have been the perfect moment of confluence between a kid who's got a story of a hero and a country that desperately needs a hero. We were mired in the Great Depression in 1938. We were about to go to war in Europe, and we were scared as heck, and we needed somebody to believe in. So suddenly we had a story that we could believe in. We had a hero that we embraced in a way that I don't think in the history of the world a hero has had that kind of overnight success, and that is where Superman came from. So that's one thing I learned about Superman that I didn't know before. The other thing I want to leave you with is one of my favorite stories, and it's part of the reason I'm here in San Diego today. I'm doing 3 talks in addition to my Comic-Con talks. You never go as an author anywhere if you can't do a minimum of 6 talks. And And so I'm doing 2 talks at a synagogue and 1 at a Jewish community center while I'm in San Diego. And the reason those places care about it is because I'm arguing, and you could say I'm nuts, but I'm arguing that Superman, among his many traits that we weren't aware of, is what religion?
Jewish.
Superman is Jewish. So I want to tell you, first of all, that if I was saying that in a Catholic church or in any Christian church, there would be people who would rightfully stand up and say, no, you don't get it. Superman is the Christ story. God sends his son to earth to show mankind that it can be better than it thought it would be. If we were at, I don't know what their churches are called, but if we were at a Buddhist retreat, they would say, no, you don't get it. Superman is the perfect Zen hero. He's one of us. If we were standing here in front of a group of agnostics and atheists, they would say, you're missing the point. Superman is the ultimate secular Messiah. So everybody wants claim on him, but I'm going to take 2 seconds to tell you how I know Superman is Jewish. Anybody know what Superman's name was when he comes down from the planet Krypton? What was his Kryptonian name? Kal-El? Who said Kal-El? Yes, he was Kal-El. Anybody know enough Hebrew to know what, you would know what the suffix El means, as in Daniel, as in Samuel, as in most of the Jewish prophets. What does El mean? God. For 500 points over here, our friend from Brooklyn, what does Kal mean? Not quite. Well, it actually means vessel or vehicle. That Superman was, his Kal-El names means that he was the vessel of God. So I want to ask you another question about Superman. What is the story, if I were to tell you that I'm telling a story about a character who is floated off, his parents, in the only way that they know how to save him, float him off, call it space, call it a river, and this baby floating off into the river is adopted by 2 Gentiles and raised as their own, and it turns out to be an exceptional baby. We would say that is the story of what? Of Moses. It is straight out of the book of Exodus. I think it's not coincidental that Superman's story sounds like it is straight out of the book of Exodus. But the last thing I want to leave you, I go through in my book lots of other evidence that this was happening on the eve of World War II, when there were these famous things. The world was blowing up, or certainly the world of Jerry was blowing up, and there were these things called kinder transports. Do you know what kinder transports were? They were a way of trying to, what were they, sir?
German Jewish children who went to live in England to escape Holocaust.
That's exactly right. Is that a South African?
Yeah.
Ah, great. So I did a book on the Jewish Diaspora, and I could, in every audience, there was always one South African who had a wonderful accent like you. That is, thank you for coming. Can you come to the rest of my talks when I'm doing the, So the last piece of evidence that I want to leave you with, if you believe nothing else about why Superman was Jewish, what do we know about any name that ends in the word man, M-A-N? We know 2 things about that. Either it is a superhero, or it's a Jew, or it's both. So that is the evidence that I want to leave you with. The last thing I want to say, I'd love to turn this into a discussion. The last thing that I want to say is, so I spent all this time supposedly looking at this for a serious reason, like what does it tell us, what does Superman tell us about ourselves and our embrace of heroes? And I want to tell you what I ended up concluding. I concluded, and I think this is particularly important for people like this gentleman here who are out there reviewing movies like The Avengers and Batman and Spider-Man, that at a time, and this is a time through now 74 years and counting, at a time when the world had, in real people and in heroes like Batman and Spider-Man, all the dark heroes. Batman's a very dark story. His whole beginnings are all about revenge for the death of his parents. Spider-Man is a very fraught and anxious character, and supposedly kids like Spider-Man because he's anxious like they are about all these things that kids go through. I suggest to you that what the world, and what the American world particularly, has always needed was a story of light. It was a story of a Dudley Do-Right kind of character who, more than anybody in our American popular culture, knew the difference between right and wrong and always managed to end up on the right side of things. And I think we are, as a society, a really optimistic place, and that our defining hero, the one who started it all, and when they take surveys still comes out number one, is the hero of righteousness and light. And I think that is, in America, there were all kinds of other things about the Superman story that made it appealing. There was a love triangle with two people, which was sort of a special kind of love triangle between Clark and Lois and Superman. There's the fact that he was an orphan, but more than anything else, it was that he was a hero of goodness, and that to me is a reason for using Superman, which is what I was trying to do, to understand a little bit better what America has really been like over the last 75 years. And what I would love to do now is stop talking and see if there are questions or discussion. Anybody, anything about Superman? George.
Tell us about how has the rest of the world embraced Superman?
Well, that's a great question. And I wasn't sure that the rest of the world did embrace Superman. So I did, in this wonderful high-tech era, you don't have to wonder about things like that. You just put out queries on certain websites. And I started hearing people's stories. So I asked a simple question on every Superman website on the internet. I asked, why did you like Superman? Tell me when you first fell in love with him, in what context? Was it TV? Was it movies? Was it whatever? And why? Most importantly, what was it about Superman? And I started getting these extraordinary stories in from kids and adults in Paris, in Serbia, across Africa, all over Latin America. And what I realized was today's Superman is ultimately a global hero. When people embrace him in those places, they understand that his roots were American, but they say, and they are right, that Superman was made, the United Nations in the comic books and everywhere else gave Superman basically a citizen of the world label, and that is precisely what he was. And that has really upset various commentators like Glenn Beck, who when Superman in the comic books became a citizen of the world and was thinking about renouncing his American citizenship, you understand the value of a cultural icon like this, that he can set off a political debate in America about whether it's okay to be a citizen of the world. But what it is about him that I think people in all those places embrace is precisely what I think they embrace about America, which is our optimism. They know that the reality of America often doesn't live up to their image of what America really is. But the same reason that people who are going in Egypt today that are trying to get a movement for democracy across the Middle East and other parts of the world, they see Superman as representative of everything that we want to be in this country. And that to me is what he means to us as well. It's not who we are, it's who, if we were smart enough, and you could look into me and not look at me and say, geez, he looks like that Clark Kent schlub. You look into me and you say, he looks like the thing that I think is inside of me, the Superman, the guy that I really want to be. And that was a long-winded answer, but I really think it's, please, back there.
I have a few questions. How old was Jerry when he wrote Superman?
Well, that's a good question, and the answer is, when Superman was published, Jerry was, I think, 20 years old. But when he wrote him, it took 5 years to get him published. He tried everything in the world, and it was partly the magic of two ex-pornographers having taken over the bankrupt DC Comics. And these guys decided they were going to give it a try with Superman. They were willing, as their pornography background suggested, to try just about anything. And they put Superman on the cover. During the first dozen issues, he was on the cover for only 3 or 4 of them. And they watched the pattern. And the pattern was, every time Superman was on the cover, the comic book stores sold out every comic book. In those days, there was a return policy in the comics business, like there was in many aspects of publishing, that anything that you didn't sell, you could return and they'd give you the full value. So you had to sell, for the publisher to make any money, they had to sell over 60%. And they were selling 120%. They were having to do new runs when Superman made it on the cover. One of the most overnight successes ever in the history of publishing.